I never thought I'd be here, staring at my reflection in the mirror, adjusting my dress for what felt like the 100th time. 10 years of marriage. A decade of love, laughter, and building a life together with Mark. Our wedding anniversary was supposed to be a celebration of everything we'd achieved, a testament to our unwavering commitment. But as I smoothed down the fabric of my emerald green dress, the one Mark always said brought out the color of my eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The past few months had been different. Mark had been distant, often coming home late from work, his usual warm greetings replaced by distracted nods and mumbled hellos. I chalked it up to stress at first. His job at the law firm had always been demanding, and lately, he'd mentioned a big case that was taking up most of his time. Still, I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to it. I shook my head, trying to dispel the nagging doubts. Tonight wasn't about my insecurities. It was about us, about the life we'd built together, and the future that stretched out before us. My eyes drifted to the dresser drawer where I'd hidden the papers, the deed to our dream house. Just thinking about it made my heart race with excitement. The lakeside property had been our shared fantasy for years. We'd spend lazy Sunday afternoons browsing real estate listings, pointing out features we loved and imagining ourselves in each home. One day, Mark would say, his arm around my shoulders, "We'll wake up to the sound of lapping waves and the smell of pine trees." I'd lean into him, basking in the warmth of his embrace and the promise of our shared dreams. When I stumbled across the listing for this particular house, it felt like fate. 2 stories of rustic charm, with a wraparound porch perfect for watching sunsets, all nestled right on the edge of Lake Winnipesaukee. It was everything we'd ever wanted, and more. The price tag was steep, $150,000 was no small sum, but I'd been squirreling away money for years, determined to make our dream a reality. The process of buying the house in secret had been nerve-wracking. Every phone call to the realtor, every meeting with the bank, felt like a covert operation. There were moments when I almost caved and told Mark everything, especially on those nights when he'd come home looking particularly worn down. But I held firm, reminding myself of the joy that would light up his face when I revealed my surprise. As I applied a final touch of lipstick, my mind wandered back to our wedding day. I remembered standing at the altar, Mark's hands in mine, his eyes shining with unshed tears as we exchanged vows. We'd been so young then, barely out of college, full of hopes and dreams for the future. Our parents had worried we were rushing into things, but we knew better. We were meant to be together. The early years of our marriage had been a whirlwind of excitement and challenges. We'd moved to Manchester for Mark's first job at a small law firm, leaving behind our families and the familiar streets of Boston. Those first few months in our tiny apartment, with its leaky faucets and temperamental heating, had tested our patience. But we'd faced every obstacle together, laughing at our mishaps and celebrating our small victories. I remembered the night Mark came home, practically bouncing with excitement, to tell me he'd been offered a position at one of the top firms in the city. We'd danced around our cramped living room, imagining the life we could build with this new opportunity. That was the night we first started talking seriously about buying a house, about putting down roots and starting a family. Family. The word brought a slight pang to my chest. We'd been trying for a baby for the past 2 years, with no luck. Each negative pregnancy test had been a blow, but Mark had been my rock through it all. "It'll happen when it's meant to happen," he'd say, holding me close. "And if it doesn't, we'll figure it out together. You're all the family I need." His words had been a balm to my soul, reassuring me that our love was enough, that we could weather any storm as long as we had each other. It was that unwavering support that had gotten me through the tougher times, the loss of my father last year, the stress of my own job as a high school English teacher, the moments of doubt and insecurity that crept in as we watched our friends start their own families. A glance at the clock jolted me out of my reverie. Mark would be home any minute. I gave myself one last once-over in the mirror, tucking a stray strand of hair behind my ear. The woman staring back at me looked nervous but hopeful. Despite the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right, I was determined to make this night perfect. I made my way downstairs, my heels clicking against the hardwood floors. The dining room table was set with our best china, candles waiting to be lit. A bottle of champagne, the same brand we'd had at our wedding, sat chilling in an ice bucket. Everything was ready. The sound of a key in the lock made my heart skip a beat. I smoothed down my dress one last time and plastered on my brightest smile. "Happy anniversary, honey," I called out as the door swung open. Mark stepped inside, looking handsome in a crisp blue shirt and dark slacks. For a moment, as his eyes met mine, I saw a flicker of something. Surprise. Guilt. But it was gone so quickly I convinced myself I'd imagined it. He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Happy anniversary, Sarah," he said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. As we sat down to dinner, I couldn't help but notice how quiet Mark was. He picked at his food, his responses to my attempts at conversation brief and distracted. I tried to chalk it up to a long day at work, but the uneasy feeling in my stomach grew stronger with each passing minute. Finally, as I was clearing the dinner plates, Mark spoke up. "I have something for you," he said, his voice oddly flat. He pulled out a small, velvet-lined box, tied with a golden ribbon. My heart fluttered with anticipation as he slid it across the table. "This is my last gift to you," he added softly. His choice of words struck me as odd, but I pushed the thought aside. Mark had always had a flair for the dramatic when it came to gifts. I reached for the ribbon, eager to see what was inside, but Mark's hand shot out, stopping me. "Not yet," he murmured. "Later." I laughed, though it sounded forced even to my own ears. "Always the man of mystery," I teased, trying to lighten the mood. I slipped the box into my purse, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it jewelry? A key to some romantic getaway he'd planned? Or maybe something sentimental, a token from our shared past? As we moved on to dessert, a decadent chocolate cake I'd spent hours perfecting, I found myself babbling to fill the silence. I talked about my students, about the latest book I was reading for my book club, about anything and everything that came to mind. Mark nodded along, but his eyes kept darting to my purse, to the mysterious box hidden inside. The tension in the room was palpable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental was about to happen. Little did I know, my whole world was about to be turned upside down. As I cut into the cake, my hand trembling slightly, I had no idea that the man sitting across from me, the man I'd loved for over a decade, was about to shatter everything I thought I knew about our life together. But for now, I held on to hope. I clung to the dream of our future, to the image of us growing old together in our lakeside home. I smiled at Mark, raising my champagne glass in a toast. "To us," I said, my voice full of love and promise. "To 10 wonderful years, and to all the years to come." If only I'd known then how hollow those words would soon become. As we finished our dessert, I could feel my heart racing. The moment I'd been waiting for, planning for months, was finally here. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. "Mark," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I have something for you too." He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I hesitated. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of, what? Anxiety? Guilt? But I pushed the thought aside. This was our moment, and I wasn't going to let my imagination ruin it. "Close your eyes," I instructed, my excitement building. Mark complied, a small frown creasing his forehead. I reached into my bag, my fingers brushing past the small box he'd given me earlier, and pulled out the folder containing the house deed. "Okay, open them," I said, barely able to contain my smile. Mark's eyes fluttered open, focusing on the folder in my hands. "What's this?" he asked, his voice oddly strained. I took a deep breath and launched into the speech I'd rehearsed 100 times. "Mark, we've been talking about our dream home for years. The place where we'd build our future, maybe start a family. Well, I found it." I opened the folder, revealing the papers inside. "I bought us that lakefront house we've always wanted. It's ours, Mark. Our dream is finally coming true." I waited for his reaction, expecting joy, surprise, maybe even happy tears. But what I saw instead made my blood run cold. Mark's face had gone pale, all color draining from his cheeks. His hands, as he reached for the papers, were visibly shaking. You bought a house," he stammered, his voice barely audible. "Sarah, you didn't have to do this." He flipped through the papers, his eyes darting across the pages without really seeing them. Then, suddenly, his gaze snapped to my bag, to the spot where I'd placed his gift. The joy I'd felt moments ago evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of unease. "Mark." I reached out, touching his arm. "What's wrong?" "I thought you'd be happy." He flinched at my touch, as if burned. I can't," he mumbled, his words trailing off into silence. Then, without warning, he lunged for my bag. "I have to take this," he muttered, his fingers closing around the small box he'd given me earlier. "I need to." Alarm bells were ringing in my head now. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I grabbed the box before he could take it, holding it tightly in my hands. "Mark, you're scaring me," I said, my voice trembling. "What's going on? Why are you acting like this?" He wouldn't meet my eyes, his gaze darting around the room like a cornered animal. "Sarah, please," he begged, reaching for the box again. "Don't open it. Not now. I made a mistake." But his words only fueled my determination. With shaking hands, I tore off the ribbon and lifted the lid. What I saw inside made my world come crashing down around me. Divorce papers. Neatly folded, waiting for my signature. And underneath, a sealed envelope with my name on it in Mark's handwriting. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to spin around me, the walls closing in. This couldn't be happening. Not today. Not after 10 years. Not after everything we'd been through together. "Sarah, Mark's voice seemed to come from far away. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't expect you to. God, I'm so sorry." "Sorry?" He was sorry. I looked up at him, tears blurring my vision. The man I'd loved for over a decade, the man I thought I knew better than anyone in the world, suddenly seemed like a stranger. With trembling fingers, I pulled out the letter. Part of me didn't want to read it, didn't want to make this nightmare any more real. But I had to know. I deserved to know. As I unfolded the paper, I could feel Mark's eyes on me. He'd stopped trying to take the box back, resigned now to whatever was about to unfold. I took a deep breath and began to read. "Dear Sarah," the letter began. "By the time you read this, I'll probably be gone. I know this isn't fair to you, and I'm a coward for doing it this way. But I don't know how else to say it. I can't do this anymore." The words swam before my eyes, each one a dagger to my heart. Mark wrote about feeling trapped, about how our marriage had become more of an obligation than a partnership. He said he'd been unhappy for years but hadn't known how to tell me. "I still care about you, Sarah," he wrote. "But I'm not in love with you anymore. I haven't been for a long time. You deserve someone who can love you the way you deserve to be loved. I'm sorry I can't be that person." I looked up from the letter, my cheeks wet with tears. I hadn't realized I was crying. Mark sat across from me, his head in his hands. The air between us felt thick, heavy with unspoken words and shattered dreams. "Why?" I finally managed to choke out. "Why today? Why like this?" Mark lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed. "I didn't plan it this way," he said, his voice hoarse. "I was going to leave the box and just go. I thought it would be easier." "Easier?" I repeated, disbelief coloring my voice. "You thought leaving divorce papers as an anniversary gift would be easier?" He flinched at my words. "I didn't know about the house," he mumbled. "I didn't think you'd." "God, Sarah, I'm so sorry." But his apologies fell on deaf ears. All I could think about was the past few months, the late nights at work, the distant behavior, the way he'd pull away when I tried to touch him. It all made sense now, in the most horrific way possible. "How long?" I demanded, my voice stronger now, fueled by a growing anger. "How long have you been planning this?" Mark wouldn't meet my eyes. "A while," he admitted. "I've been thinking about it for a long time." A long time. The words echoed in my head. While I'd been planning our future, saving for our dream home, he'd been planning his escape. Every kiss, every "I love you," every moment we'd shared in recent memory. Had it all been a lie? Is there someone else? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Part of me didn't want to know the answer, but I had to ask. Mark's hesitation told me everything I needed to know. It's not what you think, he started, but I cut him off. Don't, I said, my voice cold. Don't you dare try to justify this. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, the remains of our anniversary dinner growing cold between us. The candles I'd so carefully lit earlier had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the room. It felt like a mockery of the romantic evening I'd planned. Finally, I stood up. My legs felt weak, my whole body numb. I think you should go, I said, not looking at him. I can't do this right now. Mark nodded, getting to his feet. He moved towards the door, then paused. What about the house? He asked quietly. I let out a bitter laugh. The house? You're worried about the house right now? I shook my head, fighting back a fresh wave of tears. Just go, Mark. Please. As the door closed behind him, I sank to the floor, the weight of everything that had happened finally crashing down on me. The house papers lay scattered around me, a cruel reminder of the future I'd thought we were going to share. Mark's letter was crumpled in my fist, the words on the page burned into my memory. 10 years of marriage. A decade of shared dreams and promises. And it had all come crashing down in a single evening. As I sat there, surrounded by the remnants of my shattered life, I couldn't help but wonder, where do I go from here? How do I pick up the pieces of a life I thought was perfect, only to discover it was built on lies? The answers didn't come that night. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I was still sitting on the floor, my mind replaying every moment of my marriage, searching for signs I might have missed. The road ahead seemed impossibly long and dark. But as I watched the sun rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I made a promise to myself. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. And no matter how hard it might be, I was going to write it on my own terms. The sun had fully risen by the time I finally pulled myself off the floor. My body ached, protesting against the hours I'd spent curled up on the hardwood. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional agony that threatened to overwhelm me. I stumbled to the kitchen, my movements mechanical. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the air with a scent that would normally bring comfort. Today, it just made my stomach churn. As I waited for the coffee to brew, my eyes drifted back to the dining room table. The divorce papers lay there, a stark white against the dark wood. Next to them, Mark's letter, the one I'd read and reread 100 times throughout the night. With shaking hands, I picked up the papers again. The legal jargon swam before my eyes, but certain phrases stood out in stark relief: irreconcilable differences, dissolution of marriage, division of assets. It all seemed so cold, so final. How could 10 years of love and shared dreams be reduced to these sterile, legal terms? I flipped through the pages, noting where Mark had already signed his name. He'd been planning this for a while, that much was clear. But as I reached the last page, something caught my eye. There, in the margin, was a hastily scribbled note in Mark's handwriting. I'm sorry, Sarah. I never meant for it to end this way. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. Sorry? He was sorry? The word seemed woefully inadequate for the devastation he'd wrought. Setting aside the divorce papers, I turned my attention back to the letter. Now, in the harsh light of day, I forced myself to read it again, searching for answers, for some explanation that would make sense of this nightmare. Dear Sarah, it began, just as it had last night. I know this letter will hurt you, and I hate myself for being the cause of that pain. But I can't keep living this lie. Mark went on to explain how he'd felt trapped in our marriage for years. He wrote about the pressure he felt to be the perfect husband, to live up to the expectations of our families and friends. Everyone saw us as the ideal couple, he wrote. But inside, I was slowly suffocating. He claimed he'd tried to make it work, that he'd fought against his growing feelings of discontent. But in the end, he'd realized he couldn't continue. It's not fair to either of us, the letter said. You deserve someone who can love you completely, and I need to find out who I am outside of this marriage. As I read, I felt a maelstrom of emotions: anger, betrayal, grief, and a deep, aching sadness. How had I not seen this coming? Had I been so blind, so caught up in my own happiness that I'd missed the signs of Mark's discontent? My mind raced back over the past few years, searching for clues I might have overlooked. There had been moments, I realized, when Mark had seemed distant or frustrated. Times when he'd stay late at the office or go out with friends more often than usual. But I'd always brushed it off, attributing it to work stress or normal relationship ups and downs. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, I could see the pattern. The gradual pulling away, the subtle changes in his behavior. But even as I recognized these signs, a part of me rebelled against the idea that our entire marriage had been a lie. We'd had good times, hadn't we? I thought about our honeymoon in Hawaii, the way Mark had held my hand as we watched the sunset over the ocean. I remembered the night we'd stayed up until dawn, talking about our hopes and dreams for the future. The countless small moments of affection and companionship that had made up our life together. Had it all meant nothing to him? As if in answer to my unspoken question, my eyes fell on the final paragraph of Mark's letter. "I did love you, Sarah," he'd written. "Please believe that. What we had was real, at least in the beginning. But people change, and sometimes love isn't enough to bridge the gap." I crumpled the letter in my fist, fighting back a fresh wave of tears. How dare he? How dare he try to soften the blow with platitudes about love and change? In that moment, something inside me snapped. The shock and grief that had paralyzed me all night gave way to a burning anger. I deserved better than this. I deserved answers, real ones, not just the carefully crafted explanations in his letter. Before I could talk myself out of it, I grabbed my phone and dialed Mark's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Just as I was about to hang up, convinced he was avoiding me, I heard his voice. "Sarah." He sounded surprised, and more than a little wary. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Face to face. You owe me that much." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. For a moment, I thought he might refuse. But then, "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll be there in an hour." The next 60 minutes were the longest of my life. I paced the house, alternating between rehearsing what I wanted to say and fighting the urge to call Mark back and tell him not to come. But I held firm. I needed this confrontation, needed to look him in the eye and hear the truth from his own lips. When the doorbell finally rang, I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. I opened the door to find Mark standing there, looking as haggard as I felt. The sight of him, so familiar yet suddenly so foreign, nearly broke my resolve. But I pushed aside the ache in my chest and gestured for him to come in. We sat across from each other in the living room, the coffee table between us like a barrier. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched out, thick with unspoken words and shattered dreams. Finally, I broke the silence. "Why?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why now? Why like this?" Mark ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so achingly familiar it made my heart clench. "I don't know," he said, his voice hoarse. "I've been trying to find the right time, the right way, for months. But there never seemed to be a good moment. So you chose our anniversary?" I couldn't keep the bitterness out of my voice. "You thought leaving divorce papers as a gift was the solution?" He flinched at my words. "I know it was cowardly," he admitted. I couldn't face you. I couldn't bear to see the hurt in your eyes. But you were fine with me finding out alone." I shot back. "With leaving me to deal with this shock by myself?" Mark had no answer for that. He just sat there, head bowed, unable to meet my gaze. His silence only fueled my anger. "You owe me the truth, Mark," I said, my voice growing stronger. "All of it. Not just the sanitized version in your letter. What's really going on?" He looked up then, and I saw a flash of something in his eyes. Guilt. Fear. Before I could decipher it, he spoke. "I met someone," he said quietly. The words hit me like a physical blow. Even though I'd suspected, hearing it confirmed was devastating. "How long?" I managed to ask. 6 months, Mark replied, his voice barely audible. 6 months. Half a year of lies, of sneaking around behind my back. While I'd been planning our anniversary, saving for our dream home, he'd been building a life with someone else. The room seemed to spin around me. I gripped the arms of my chair, fighting to stay upright. "Who is she?" I demanded. Mark hesitated, then said, It's not a she, Sarah. It's a he. His name is David. He's a colleague at the firm." The revelation stunned me into silence. Of all the scenarios I'd imagined, this hadn't even crossed my mind.
"You're gay,"
I finally managed to ask. "Bisexual," Mark corrected gently. "I've known for a while, but I was afraid to admit it, even to myself. Meeting David, it forced me to confront feelings I'd been suppressing for years." I sat there, trying to process this new information. Part of me wanted to scream, to rage at him for keeping this secret, for building our life on a foundation of lies. But another part, the part that still loved him, despite everything, ached for the struggle he must have gone through. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my anger giving way to a profound sadness. "We could have faced this together. We could have." "Could have what?" Mark interrupted, a note of frustration in his voice. "Stayed in a marriage where I could never be fully myself. Where I'd always be living a lie." His words stung, but I couldn't deny the truth in them. Still, the pain of betrayal burned hot in my chest. "You should have been honest with me," I said. "I deserved that much." Mark nodded, his eyes filled with regret. "You're right," he said softly. "You deserved so much better than this. Than me." We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of everything that had been said, and everything that hadn't, hanging heavy between us. Finally, I spoke. "What happens now?" Mark sighed, looking as lost as I felt. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think we both know this is the end." As much as it hurt to hear those words, I knew he was right. There was no going back from this, no way to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. Our marriage, the life we'd built together, was over. "I'll move out," Mark said, standing up. "You should keep the house. It was your dream, after all." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. As he moved towards the door, I found my voice. "Mark." He turned back, his hand on the doorknob. "I hope you find happiness," I said, surprised to find I meant it. A sad smile crossed his face. "I hope you do too, Sarah," he replied. "You deserve it more than anyone." As the door closed behind him, I felt a strange mix of emotions, grief for the end of my marriage, anger at the betrayal, but also a glimmer of something else. Something that felt almost like relief. The road ahead would be hard, I knew. There would be more tears, more pain, more difficult conversations. But as I stood there, in the house that had once represented our shared dreams, I realized something. This wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the beginning of a new chapter in my life. A chapter where I could rediscover who I was outside of being Mark's wife. And despite the pain, despite the uncertainty, I found myself looking forward to seeing where this new path might lead. The days following Mark's departure blurred together in a haze of disbelief and pain. I moved through our house, my house now, I supposed, like a ghost, touching familiar objects that suddenly felt alien. The coffee mug Mark always used still sat in the dish rack. His favorite sweater hung forgotten on the back of a chair. Each item was a stark reminder of the life we'd shared and the future we'd lost. I found myself replaying our last conversation over and over in my mind, searching for something I might have missed, some clue that could make sense of it all. The revelation about David, Mark's colleague, had thrown me for a loop. How had I not known? How had I missed such a fundamental part of who my husband was? In quiet moments, when the pain wasn't so sharp, I tried to put myself in Mark's shoes. What must it have been like, I wondered, to struggle with your identity in silence? To feel trapped in a life that didn't align with who you truly were? The empathy I felt in these moments surprised me, a counterpoint to the anger and betrayal that still burned in my chest. But then I'd remember the lies, the sneaking around, the months of deception, and the empathy would give way to a fresh wave of hurt and anger. Why couldn't he have trusted me enough to tell me the truth? We could have faced it together, found a way forward that didn't involve such devastating betrayal. One afternoon, about a week after Mark left, I found myself sitting at my dining room table, a bottle of wine half empty beside me. In front of me lay the divorce papers, Mark's letter, and a stack of photo albums I'd pulled from the bookshelf in a moment of masochistic nostalgia. I flipped through the albums, tracing our history together. There we were on our first date, both of us looking so young and carefree. Our college graduation, arms around each other, faces beaming with pride and hope for the future. Our wedding day, the love in Mark's eyes so apparent it made my heart ache. Had it all been a lie? No, I decided, taking another sip of wine. It couldn't have all been fake. The Mark in these photos, the man I'd fallen in love with, he had been real. Somewhere along the way, things had changed, but I refused to believe that every moment we'd shared had been a deception. Still, questions gnawed at me, refusing to let me find peace. When exactly had things changed for Mark? Was there a specific moment when he realized he wasn't happy, or had it been a gradual drift? And why, oh why, hadn't he felt he could talk to me about it? In a moment of weakness, or perhaps courage, I wasn't sure which, I pulled out my phone and called Mark. To my surprise, he answered on the second ring. Sarah. His voice was cautious, wary. Is everything okay? I almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. Was anything okay? I need to understand, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I have questions, Mark. I deserve answers. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. For a moment, I thought he might hang up. But then he sighed, a sound so familiar it made my chest ache. Okay, he said softly. What do you want to know? The questions tumbled out of me then, a torrent of confusion and hurt. When did you know? That you weren't happy, that you were attracted to men? Was it before we got married? Did you ever really love me, or was I just a convenient cover? Sarah, stop. Mark's voice cut through my flood of questions. Please. I know you're hurting, and you have every right to be angry. But please don't doubt that I loved you. I did. I still do, just not in the way a husband should love his wife. His words were like a knife to my heart, both comforting and painful at the same time. Then why? I asked, my voice breaking. Why didn't you tell me? We could have figured it out together. Mark was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. I was scared, he admitted. Scared of losing you, of disappointing our families, of facing a truth about myself that I wasn't ready to accept. It was easier to pretend, to convince myself that if I just tried hard enough, I could be the husband you deserved. I closed my eyes, fighting back tears. But you couldn't. No, he said softly. I couldn't. And it wasn't fair to either of us to keep pretending. We talked for hours that night, delving into the history of our relationship from Mark's perspective. He told me about the doubts he'd had even before our wedding, the way he'd pushed them aside, convinced that marrying me was the right thing to do. He spoke about the growing realization of his attraction to men, the confusion and self-loathing he'd felt as he tried to reconcile these feelings with the life we'd built together. Meeting David, it was like a wake-up call, Mark explained. Suddenly, all the feelings I'd been suppressing for years came rushing to the surface. I couldn't ignore them anymore. As I listened to Mark's story, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of me was angry that he'd kept all of this from me for so long. Another part ached for the struggle he must have gone through. And beneath it all was a profound sadness for the years we'd lost, for the honest conversations we could have had if only we'd been brave enough to face the truth together. I'm sorry, Mark said as our conversation wound down. I know those words aren't enough, but I am truly sorry for the pain I've caused you. I sighed, feeling drained but somehow lighter. I'm sorry too, I said. Sorry that you felt you couldn't be honest with me. Sorry that we both spent so long living a lie. As I hung up the phone, I realized that while I still had a long way to go before I could forgive Mark completely, I at least understood him better now. The conversation hadn't erased the hurt or magically fixed everything, but it had given me a perspective I'd been lacking before. In the days that followed, I found myself looking at our marriage, and its end, with new eyes. Yes, Mark had betrayed me. Yes, the pain of that betrayal was still raw and real. But I also began to see how we had both contributed to the breakdown of our relationship. We'd both been guilty of avoiding difficult conversations, of prioritizing the appearance of a perfect marriage over the messy reality of our true feelings. One evening, as I sat on the porch of the lakeside house, the house that was supposed to be our fresh start but had instead become a symbol of our ending, I made a decision. I couldn't change the past. I couldn't undo the hurt or rewrite our story. But I could choose how to move forward. I pulled out a notebook and began to write. I wrote about the good times Mark and I had shared, the love that had been real even if it hadn't lasted. I wrote about the pain of his betrayal, the shock of discovering that the future I'd planned had crumbled to dust. I wrote about my anger, my confusion, my fear of what came next. And then, slowly, hesitantly, I began to write about hope. Hope that I could heal from this. Hope that I could learn from our mistakes and build a life that was truly authentic. Hope that someday, I might even be able to look back on my marriage with gratitude for the lessons it had taught me. As the sun set over the lake, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I felt something shift inside me. The pain was still there, a dull ache in my chest. But alongside it was something new, a sense of possibility, of potential. This wasn't the ending I had wanted or expected for my marriage. But maybe, just maybe, it could be the beginning of something new. A chance to rediscover myself, to build a life that was truly my own. I closed my notebook and took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp evening air. For the first time since that fateful anniversary night, I felt a glimmer of excitement for the future. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew one thing for certain. I was ready to face it, on my own terms. As I stood up to head inside, I paused for a moment, looking out over the tranquil waters of the lake. The house behind me was full of memories, both happy and painful. But it was also full of potential, a blank canvas waiting for new stories to be written. "Here's to new beginnings," I whispered to the fading light. And for the first time in weeks, I felt the ghost of a smile tugging at my lips. The road ahead might be uncertain, but I was ready to take the first step. The weeks following my conversation with Mark were a roller coaster of emotions. Some days, I felt like I was drowning in a sea of grief and anger. Other days, I caught glimpses of hope, fleeting moments where I could imagine a future beyond the pain of my failed marriage. It was during one of my darker moments, curled up on the couch with a pint of ice cream and a box of tissues, that my phone buzzed. It was my best friend, Lisa. "Enough wallowing," her text read. "I'm coming over. We're getting you out of that house." An hour later, Lisa was at my door, armed with a determined smile and a plan. "We're going for a walk," she announced, leaving no room for argument. "Fresh air and exercise. Doctor's orders." I wanted to protest, to burrow deeper into my cocoon of misery, but something in Lisa's tone made me pause. Maybe she was right. Maybe what I needed was to step out of my self-imposed isolation. As we walked along the lakeside path, the crisp autumn air nipping at our cheeks, I found myself opening up to Lisa in a way I hadn't been able to before. I told her everything, about the anniversary dinner, the divorce papers, Mark's revelation about his sexuality. Lisa listened without judgment, offering nothing but support and understanding. When I finished, she turned to me with a fierce look in her eyes. "Sarah," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "you are one of the strongest people I know. This situation sucks, no doubt about it. But you're going to get through this. And you're not alone." Her words were like a lifeline, pulling me out of the depths of my despair. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of something other than pain, determination. That walk with Lisa became a turning point. I realized that while I couldn't control what had happened to my marriage, I could control how I responded to it. I could choose to let this experience break me, or I could use it as a catalyst for growth and change. With newfound resolve, I began to take small steps towards reclaiming my life. I called my parents, finally telling them about the divorce. Their reaction was a mix of shock and concern, but underneath it all was an unwavering love and support that brought tears to my eyes. "Come home for a while," my mom suggested. "Get away from all those memories. Give yourself some space to heal." At first, I balked at the idea. Leaving felt too much like running away. But the more I thought about it, the more appealing it became. A change of scenery, a chance to reconnect with my roots. Maybe that was exactly what I needed. So, I packed a bag and headed to my childhood home in the suburbs of Boston. Being back in my old room, surrounded by the mementos of my youth, was both comforting and strange. It was as if I was straddling two versions of myself, the carefree girl I used to be and the broken woman I'd become. My parents were amazing, giving me space when I needed it and offering comfort when the pain became too much to bear alone. Slowly but surely, I felt myself starting to heal. One afternoon, as I was helping my mom in the garden, she turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Sarah," she said, her hands deep in the soil, "sometimes life doesn't go according to plan. But that doesn't mean the new path can't be beautiful too." Her words stuck with me, echoing in my mind as I lay awake that night. I thought about the life I'd planned with Mark, the dreams we'd shared. But then I started to think about new dreams, ones that were solely my own. With a jolt of excitement, I realized there were things I'd always wanted to do but had put aside for the sake of our marriage. I'd always dreamed of writing a novel, but I'd convinced myself I didn't have the time. Now, with my life in flux, why not give it a shot? The next day, I went out and bought a beautiful leather-bound journal. That evening, sitting on the porch swing of my parents' house, I began to write. The words flowed out of me, a story of love, loss, and redemption. It wasn't autobiographical, not exactly, but it was infused with the raw emotions of my own experience. Writing became my therapy, a way to process my feelings and rediscover my voice. As the pages of my journal filled up, I felt a sense of accomplishment I hadn't experienced in years. But my journey of self-discovery didn't stop there. Encouraged by my progress, I decided to tackle another long-held dream, learning to paint. I signed up for an art class at the local community center, nervous but excited. My first attempts were laughably bad, but I found I didn't care. There was something freeing about splashing color on canvas, about creating something that was uniquely mine. And as the weeks went by, I saw improvement not just in my paintings, but in my outlook on life. It wasn't all smooth sailing, of course. There were still days when the pain of my failed marriage hit me like a tidal wave. Days when I'd come across an old photo or a reminder of Mark, and I'd feel like I was right back at square one. But I was learning to ride those waves of emotion, to acknowledge the pain without letting it consume me. And with each passing day, I felt a little stronger, a little more like myself. One of the hardest parts of the process was dealing with the legal aspects of the divorce. I knew I needed to protect myself, to ensure that the end of my marriage didn't leave me financially vulnerable. With some trepidation, I reached out to a divorce attorney recommended by a friend. Meeting with the lawyer, a kind-faced woman named Rachel, was a wake-up call. She helped me understand my rights and options, guiding me through the complexities of asset division and alimony. It wasn't easy, facing the practical realities of dismantling the life Mark and I had built together. But it was necessary, and in a way, empowering. As we worked through the details, Rachel looked at me with a mix of compassion and admiration. "You're handling this remarkably well," she said. "Many people in your situation struggle to think clearly about these things." Her words made me realize how far I'd come. Yes, I was still hurting. Yes, there were still moments of doubt and fear. But I was moving forward, taking control of my life in a way I never had before. One of the biggest decisions I faced was what to do with the lakeside house. Part of me wanted to sell it, to rid myself of the painful memories it held. But another part of me, a stronger part, saw it as a symbol of my resilience. After much soul-searching, I decided to keep the house. It would be a challenge, financially and emotionally, but I was determined to turn it into a home that was truly mine. A place where I could write, paint, and build the life I wanted for myself. As the legal proceedings moved forward, I found myself having to interact with Mark more frequently. Each encounter was a test of my newfound strength, but I was surprised to find that it got easier with time. The raw pain of his betrayal was slowly being replaced by a kind of bittersweet acceptance. During one of our meetings to discuss the division of our assets, Mark looked at me with a mix of regret and admiration. "You seem different," he said hesitantly. "Stronger." I considered his words for a moment before responding. "I am stronger," I said, realizing the truth of it as I spoke. "This isn't the life I planned, Mark. But it's the life I have, and I'm determined to make the most of it." As I drove home that day, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The road ahead was still uncertain, full of challenges I couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time since that fateful anniversary night, I felt truly hopeful about the future. I thought about the novel taking shape in my journal, the paintings stacked in the corner of my room, the plans I was making for renovating the lakeside house. None of these things erased the pain of what I'd been through, but they were proof that life could go on, that beauty could emerge from the ashes of broken dreams. That evening, as I sat on the porch of my parents' house, watching the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink, I made a promise to myself. I would no longer define myself by my failed marriage or by the dreams I'd shared with Mark. Instead, I would embrace this new chapter of my life with open arms, ready for whatever adventures lay ahead. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, I smiled to myself. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But I was ready for it. Ready to reclaim my power, to rewrite my story, and to discover just how strong I could be on my own. A year had passed since that fateful anniversary night, and as I stood on the porch of my lakeside house, I marveled at how much had changed. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the trees surrounding the property were starting to turn brilliant shades of red and gold. It was a scene of breathtaking beauty, one that I now had the presence of mind to truly appreciate. I took a sip of my morning coffee, savoring the warmth and the quiet of the early hour. This had become my favorite time of day, a moment of peace before diving into the bustle of my new life. Who would have thought, a year ago, that I'd be standing here, not just surviving but thriving? The journey hadn't been easy. There were days when the weight of my grief and anger threatened to pull me under. Days when I questioned every decision I'd ever made, wondering how I'd ended up here. But those days had become fewer and farther between, replaced by a growing sense of peace and purpose. My decision to keep the house had been a turning point. At first, it had felt like a defiant gesture, a way of proving to myself, and maybe to Mark, that I could handle it on my own. But as the months passed, it had become so much more than that. This house, once a symbol of my shattered dreams, had transformed into a sanctuary of self-discovery and growth. I'd thrown myself into renovating, channeling my emotions into physical labor. I painted walls, refinished floors, and even learned basic plumbing, thanks to countless YouTube tutorials and the patient guidance of my dad. Each improvement, no matter how small, felt like a victory, a step towards making this space truly mine. The spare bedroom had been converted into an art studio, filled with the light from the large bay window overlooking the lake. My paintings, once clumsy and hesitant, now covered the walls, a visual diary of my emotional journey over the past year. I wasn't Picasso by any means, but there was a raw honesty in my work that gave me a sense of pride. And then there was my writing. The novel I'd started in those early, painful days after the divorce had taken on a life of its own. What began as a form of therapy had evolved into a genuine passion. I'd even mustered up the courage to share some chapters with a local writers group, and their encouragement had been a balm to my soul. Of course, it hadn't all been smooth sailing. The first few months of living alone in the house had been tough. Every creak and groan of the old building would startle me awake at night, and the silence often felt oppressive. But slowly, I'd learned to find comfort in the solitude, to appreciate the freedom of answering only to myself. Financially, things had been tight. Even with the settlement from the divorce, maintaining the house on a teacher's salary was a challenge. I'd taken on tutoring gigs in the evenings and weekends to make ends meet. It was exhausting at times, but there was a satisfaction in knowing that I was standing on my own 2 feet. My relationship with Mark had evolved too. The raw pain of his betrayal had faded, replaced by a kind of bittersweet acceptance. We weren't friends, not really, but we'd reached a place of civil coexistence. I'd even met David once, at a mutual friend's birthday party. It had been awkward and a little painful, but also strangely cathartic. Seeing them together, I'd realized that the end of our marriage truly had been for the best, even if the way it happened was far from ideal. My parents had been my rocks throughout this whole process. They'd offered unwavering support, from helping with house repairs to simply lending an ear when I needed to vent. Their love and belief in me had been a constant source of strength, reminding me of who I was beyond my identity as Mark's wife. Friends, both old and new, had played a crucial role in my healing too. Lisa, true to her word, had been there every step of the way, dragging me out of the house when I needed it and offering a shoulder to cry on during the tougher moments. I'd also found unexpected connections through my art class and writers group, forming friendships with people who knew me as I was now, unburdened by the baggage of my past. One of the most surprising developments had been my growing relationship with my neighbor, Tom. A widower in his early 50s, Tom had initially just been a friendly face, offering to help with yard work or lend me tools for my various home improvement projects. But over time, our chats over the fence had turned into coffee on the porch, and then dinners where we'd talk for hours about everything and nothing. There was no rush, no pressure with Tom. We were both healing from our own losses, finding comfort in each other's company. Whether our relationship would develop into something more remained to be seen, but for now, I was content with the easy friendship we shared. As I stood on the porch, reflecting on the past year, I felt a surge of gratitude wash over me. Yes, my life had taken an unexpected turn. The future I'd planned with Mark was gone, replaced by something entirely different. But in losing what I thought I wanted, I'd gained something invaluable, a deeper understanding of myself, of my strength and resilience. I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, broken and lost, unable to imagine a life beyond my marriage. If I could go back and talk to her, what would I say? That the pain wouldn't last forever. That there was light at the end of the tunnel, even if she couldn't see it yet. That she was stronger than she knew. All of those things were true, but perhaps the most important lesson I'd learned was this: life rarely goes according to plan, but that doesn't mean the new path can't be beautiful. My mom's words from all those months ago echoed in my mind, and I smiled at how prophetic they'd turned out to be. I took another sip of my coffee, watching as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting a golden glow over the lake. In a few hours, I'd be heading to school, ready to inspire a new batch of students with my love of literature. Then, in the evening, I had a meeting with a small publishing house that had expressed interest in my novel. The thought filled me with a mix of excitement and nerves, but mostly, I felt ready. Ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "Lunch today," it read. "I want to hear all about this mystery meeting you've been hinting at." I smiled, typing out a quick reply. My circle might be smaller now, but it was filled with people who truly cared about me, who supported my dreams and celebrated my successes. Before heading inside to get ready for the day, I took one last look at the beautiful scene before me. The lake, the trees, the house, it was all a reminder of how far I'd come. A year ago, I thought my life was over. Now, I realized it was just beginning. I didn't know what the future held. There would undoubtedly be more challenges, more moments of doubt and fear. But I was no longer afraid to face them. I had weathered the storm of my divorce and come out stronger on the other side. Whatever life threw at me next, I knew I could handle it. As I turned to go inside, I paused for a moment, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air. "Here's to new beginnings," I whispered, echoing the words I'd spoken to myself all those months ago. But this time, there was no hesitation, no lingering doubt. Just a quiet confidence and a genuine excitement for what lay ahead. My journey wasn't over, in many ways, it was just beginning. But I was ready for it. Ready to embrace the unknown, to keep growing and learning. Ready to write the next chapter of my life, on my own terms. With a smile on my face and hope in my heart, I stepped back into the house, my house, ready to face whatever the day might bring. The pain of my past hadn't disappeared entirely, and perhaps it never would. But it no longer defined me. Instead, it had become a part of my story, a chapter that had led me to where I was now, stronger, wiser, and finally, truly happy. As I closed the door behind me, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The future was unwritten, full of possibilities. And for the first time in a long time, I couldn't wait to see what it held.